At 2 a.m., my husband thought I was asleep, but I heard him whispering on the phone. Tomorrow she'll sign the will. In a month, the problem will solve itself. What he was discussing with our daughter, and when I learned their entire plan, made me in the morning. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. I used to think that the worst thing that could happen to a woman my age was loneliness. I was wrong. The worst thing is betrayal, quiet, patient, and wearing the face of someone you love. My name is Dorothy Callahan. I am 74 years old. I live in the same White House in Asheville, North Carolina, where I raised my children, planted my roses, and buried my husband, Gerald, 6 years ago. After Gerald passed, the house felt too big and too silent. My daughter Renee suggested I wasn't safe living alone. My son-in-law Martin offered to help manage my finances. I thought they were being kind. I thought that was what family did. For 40 years I taught high school English. I read Fitzgerald, Faulkner, O'Connor. I knew something about characters and their hidden motives. But somehow, when the story was my own, I became the most naive reader in the room. Life before that night in October was ordinary in the way that only a person looking back can truly appreciate. I gardened in the mornings. I had lunch on Tuesdays with my neighbor, Patsy Whitmore. I video called my grandchildren, Renee's kids, Lily and Connor, on Sunday evenings. I took my blood pressure medication at 7 a.m. and my calcium supplement at noon. I was careful, consistent, and content. The first warning signs I now understand had been there for months. I simply hadn't wanted to see them. It started with small things. Renee began calling more often. Not to chat, but to ask questions. About the house. About my retirement accounts. About what I planned to do with Gerald's life insurance. I told myself she was being responsible. She was nearly 50, practical by nature, always the organized one. When she suggested I see a financial planner, I nodded. When she said she could sit in on the meeting, I didn't object. I should have. Then Martin started appearing on weekday afternoons. Martin Greer was my son-in-law for 22 years. He sold commercial real estate, drove a new truck every 2 years, and had the kind of permanent smile that never quite reached his eyes. He began dropping by with excuses: a leaking gutter, a fence post that needed checking, a grocery run he was already doing anyway. Each visit ended with him walking through a different room of the house, looking at the walls, the ceilings, the floors, as if he were estimating something. One afternoon, I found him standing in Gerald's study, running his hand along the built-in bookshelves. "Beautiful craftsmanship," he said. "You know what this property is worth now, Dorothy? With the market the way it is?" I said I wasn't planning to sell. He smiled. "Of course not, just saying." I replayed that conversation many times after. The week before everything changed, Renee brought me a stack of papers. She sat across from me at the kitchen table with a cup of my coffee and said she'd been talking to an estate attorney. "Just to get things in order, Mom, for everyone's peace of mind." The papers included a new will, a financial power of attorney, and a healthcare directive. Renee had already filled in most of the blanks. Her name appeared everywhere. Martin's name appeared in 2 places. "You don't have to sign today," she said. But she left the papers on the table. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the dark listening to the house settle, the way it always does after 10 p.m., the old wood contracting in the cold air. Gerald used to say the house was just breathing. I heard Martin's voice before I heard the words. It was nearly 2 in the morning. I had gotten up for a glass of water and was passing the guest room. Renee and Martin were staying the week, something about renovations at their house, when I heard him through the door, speaking in a low, careful whisper. "She'll sign the will tomorrow. Renee's going to walk her through it in the morning while she's still groggy from the sleep medication." A pause. The doctor already said her heart is getting worse. A month, maybe 2, and the whole thing resolves itself. We won't have to do anything. I stood in the hallway in my nightgown, bare feet on the cold floor, holding a glass I had forgotten I was carrying. Won't have to do anything. I did not move for what felt like a very long time. The glass in my hand was shaking slightly. I steadied it, pressed my back against the wall, and breathed through my nose the way I had taught myself to breathe during the hardest years. The years of Gerald's illness, the years of budget cuts and difficult students, and a world that didn't always make sense. Then I walked back to my bedroom, set the glass on the nightstand, and lay down. I did not sleep, but I did not cry either. I simply began to think. By 4 in the morning, I had gone over every conversation from the past 8 months and found the pattern I had been too trusting to see while it was forming. The financial planner meeting, where Renee had done most of the talking. The afternoon Martin had photographed the house for insurance purposes. The appointment Renee had scheduled with my cardiologist without telling me until the day before, where she sat beside me and asked the doctor, in her careful, reasonable voice, whether my condition was likely to progress significantly in the coming year. The doctor had spoken gently about the reality of aging hearts. Renee had nodded and taken notes. She had been building a case, not against an enemy, against her own mother. I lay there in the dark and felt fear move through me like cold water. Not the sharp, sudden fear of a loud noise, but the slow, spreading kind. The fear of understanding something that cannot be ununderstood. My daughter, whom I had nursed through chickenpox and a broken engagement and a miscarriage she never told her husband about, had decided that I was a problem to be managed. That my life, my home, my savings, everything Gerald and I had built across 5 decades, were assets to be transferred on a timeline she and Martin had already calculated. Won't have to do anything. Martin's words. And what had he meant? That my heart would simply give out? That they were counting on it? I thought about the sleep medication Renee had mentioned. I thought about how she had started bringing it to me each night herself, pressed into my palm with a glass of water and a goodnight kiss. I hadn't questioned it. Why would I? I got up at 5:30. I did not take the pill she had left on my nightstand. I put on my robe and went to the kitchen and made coffee and sat at the table with Gerald's old legal pad and a pen. I was a woman who made lists. I had always made lists. It was how I processed the world, one line at a time until the shape of a problem became visible. What did I know for certain? Martin was on a phone call at 2 a.m., discussing my will and my death with someone. Renee had prepared legal documents naming herself as my primary beneficiary and power of attorney. I had been given sleep medication each night by my daughter without a clear explanation of the prescription. My cardiologist had been consulted about the timeline of my decline. What did I not yet know? Who Martin had been speaking to? Whether the documents Renee brought were legally valid as drafted? Whether the medication was what she said it was? Whether anyone else was involved? What could I do? I pressed the pen to the paper and wrote the first word. Attorney. Not Renee's estate attorney. My own. Someone she didn't know from a firm she had never heard of. I had met a woman at Patsy's book club 2 years ago, Frances Odom, a recently retired family law attorney who had moved to Asheville after 30 years in Charlotte. She had given me her card because we'd had a long conversation about Willa Cather. I still had the card in Gerald's old Rolodex on the desk in the study. The second word I wrote was doctor. I needed to speak to my cardiologist alone, without Renee in the room, and I needed to ask specific questions about what she had been told and what information she had been given by my family. The third word, medication. I needed to know what I had been taking, The pill bottle in the bathroom said Ambien and had my name on it, but it had appeared 2 weeks ago without a pharmacy receipt, and I had never been prescribed a sleep medication by my own doctor. The fourth word I wrote was the hardest: evidence, because none of what I knew meant anything without proof. I could not walk into an attorney's office and say my daughter had whispered something in the night. I could not accuse Martin of planning to wait for my death without something more than a conversation I had overheard through a closed door. I needed documentation, recorded conversations, a paper trail, something a court would take seriously. I was a 74-year-old retired English teacher, not a private investigator. But I had spent 40 years teaching students to read carefully, think critically, and find evidence for every claim. I knew how to build a case. When I heard Renee's footsteps in the upstairs hallway at 7:15, I folded the legal pad and slid it inside the cover of the large Oxford English dictionary on the kitchen shelf. Then I put the kettle on, turned to face the window, and waited. She came downstairs in her bathrobe, her hair pulled back, carrying her phone. She kissed me on the cheek and said, "Morning, Mom. How'd you sleep?" "Wonderfully," I said. I handed her a cup of coffee and smiled. And I watched her face, the way I had once watched students who thought they'd gotten away with something, looking for the small, involuntary flicker of relief. There it was. She thought I was still her manageable, agreeable, sleeping mother. She had no idea I had been awake for 5 hours, thinking clearly for the first time in months. That afternoon, while Renee took a nap and Martin drove to Home Depot, for reasons I no longer bothered to believe, I walked 3 blocks to Patsy's house and borrowed her phone. I called Frances Odom at 2:17 p.m. She answered on the third ring. I told her I needed to speak with her privately and urgently. She asked if I could come to her home office the following morning. "Yes," I said. "But please don't contact me at my home number or on my personal cell. I'll explain when I see you." There was a brief pause. Frances was a smart woman. "I understand," she said. 9 o'clock. I walked back home through the autumn leaves, the bright orange and red of the Asheville Hills all around me, and I felt something shift inside my chest that had nothing to do with my heart condition. It was clarity, and beneath it, something older and harder. Resolve. Frances Odom's home office was in the back of a neat craftsman bungalow on Kimberly Avenue, behind a garden that was still holding its late autumn color. She was a trim woman in her mid-60s, with silver hair and the kind of deliberate stillness that comes from spending decades in courtrooms. She listened to everything I said without interrupting. When I finished, she set down her pen and looked at me for a moment. "Dorothy," she said, "what you're describing has a name. It's called undue influence, and in cases where financial documents are prepared by a family member who stands to benefit, combined with evidence of isolation and medication management, it rises to the level of elder financial abuse under North Carolina law." I had suspected as much, but hearing it spoken aloud in a lawyer's voice in the cool morning light made it real in a different way. Frances told me what I needed to do, in what order. First, I needed to establish legal representation immediately and ensure that any documents I had been presented with were reviewed before I signed anything. Second, I needed to speak to my own physician, not my cardiologist, but my primary care doctor, separately and privately, and request a formal cognitive evaluation to create an official record that I was of sound mind and had not requested any sedative medication. Third, I needed to document everything I could remember with dates, times, and specific language. And fourth, I needed to be patient. "The goal," Frances said, "is not to confront. Not yet. The goal is to build a foundation so solid that when you do act, nothing they say can touch it." I walked out of that office with a signed representation agreement in my purse and a list of next steps written in Frances's clear, even handwriting. The morning felt different. Asheville in November has a particular quality of light, low and golden, coming through the bare branches at a long angle. I drove myself home and went inside and acted exactly as I always had. What I didn't know was that Renee had already noticed something. That evening, she mentioned casually that she'd seen Mrs. Whitmore while getting the mail. "She said she saw you walking to her house yesterday?" Renee's tone was light, but her eyes were watchful. "I didn't know you two had plans." "We don't always need plans," I said. "She's my neighbor." "Of course." A pause. "You could have just used your cell, though, Mom, if you needed to make a call." I looked at her directly. "I know that, sweetheart." She smiled and changed the subject, but I saw her send a text message when she thought I wasn't looking. 2 days later, I saw my primary care physician, Dr. Anita Reeves, at a routine appointment I had already had scheduled. I had called ahead and asked the receptionist to note that this visit was to be private. No family members in the examination room, and no information released to anyone without my written authorization. I also asked Dr. Reeves to run a complete blood panel. The results came back 4 days later. My blood showed trace amounts of a benzodiazepine compound, specifically a low dose of lorazepam. I had not been prescribed lorazepam. I had not, to my knowledge, ever taken it. I sat with that information for a full 24 hours before I called Frances. "That's your proof," Frances said. Her voice was very calm. "That's the point of no return." The medication Renee had been pressing into my palm each night, the pill she told me was Ambien for sleep, contained a compound that was not what she said it was. Lorazepam at low doses would not simply help me sleep. It would keep me compliant, slow, slightly confused, easy to manage, easy to guide toward a signature. Frances asked me to bring the pill bottle to her office. I brought it the following morning. She photographed it, documented the label, and sent it to a pharmacist she trusted for independent analysis. She also contacted an elder law specialist colleague at a firm in Charlotte who had handled similar cases. The case now had a second professional supporting it. It had medical evidence, it had legal representation, and it had, for the first time, the shape of something that could win. That same afternoon, Martin knocked on the study door where I was reading and sat down across from me with the relaxed confidence of a man who believed he was still in control of the situation. He asked if I had thought any more about the documents Renee had left. "I'm still looking them over," I said. "There's no rush," he said. "But the attorney did say that having things formalized sooner rather than later gives you more control, not less. It protects you, Dorothy." He said it warmly, generously, as though he were doing me a favor. I nodded and thanked him. I watched him leave the room, and I thought, "You have no idea that the pharmacist's report will be ready by Friday. You have no idea that Frances Odom is already on the phone with the Charlotte firm. You have no idea that this house, this chair, this quiet room is no longer your plan. It is mine." I turned back to my book. My hands were steady. By the second week of November, the plan had 4 concrete elements. Frances had advised patience, but she had also said that the window to act was not indefinite. Renee and Martin would keep pressing for the signature, and the longer I delayed without explanation, the more likely they were to grow suspicious or take some form of preemptive action. The first element was a new, independent will. I drafted it with Frances over 2 sessions. Everything was simple and intentional. The house would go into a living trust I controlled. A portion of Gerald's life insurance and my retirement savings would be placed in a structured charitable remainder trust managed by the community foundation I had supported for years. Specific bequests would go to Patsy, to my former teaching colleague Ruth Ann Hartley, and to Lily and Connor's college funds. not through their parents, but directly with a trustee appointed by the court. Renee would receive a modest inheritance, as was fair. But she would not receive the house. She would not receive the accounts. She would not receive power of attorney. The second element was a formal police report. Francis had advised this carefully. Given the medication evidence, we had grounds to file a report with the Buncombe County Sheriff's Office documenting suspected elder abuse. This was not something I did lightly. Renee was my daughter. I had loved her for 50 years. But the report was not an accusation in the public sense. Not yet. It was documentation. A timestamp. Proof that I had raised the issue while I was still in full possession of my faculties, before any signature had been obtained. I filed the report on a Thursday morning, in person, with Francis present. The third element was my cardiologist. I requested a separate, private appointment and asked for a complete review of any communications she had received from Renee or from Martin about my condition. What I learned was careful but significant. Renee had called the office on 2 occasions, asking about the likely progression of my heart disease. She had described herself as my primary caregiver and had asked whether cognitive changes were common in patients with my diagnosis. My cardiologist, who had known me for 11 years, had found the calls unusual, but had not known they were unauthorized. She documented them now at my request and signed a letter confirming my cognitive clarity. The fourth element was the pharmacist's report. It had come back confirming the presence of lorazepam in the pills I had provided. Francis photographed every page. It was on a Friday afternoon, the 15th of November, that everything accelerated. Renee knocked on my bedroom door while I was at my writing desk and asked if we could talk. Her voice had a new quality, careful and slightly taut, like a wire under strain. I said yes. She sat on the edge of the bed. Martin stood in the doorway. "Mom," Renee said, "we know you went to see a lawyer." I didn't ask how. I simply waited. "We're not angry," she said. "We understand you might have concerns. But what you need to understand is that this was all done to protect you. Martin and I have been worried sick about you living here alone, about your health, about what happens if—" She stopped. "We're your family. We love you. This was never about anything other than making sure you're taken care of." Martin spoke from the doorway. His voice was quieter, and there was something beneath the warmth now that I recognized. A harder register. "Dorothy, you have to understand the position this puts us in. Lily and Connor need stability. Renee has sacrificed a lot to be here for you. If you bring attorneys and legal complications into this, if you make accusations, it could hurt people who love you. It could damage the whole family." I looked at him. "Are you threatening me, Martin?" "Of course not." The smile again. "I'm telling you what's at stake." "What's at stake," I said, "is my home, my money, and my independence. I understand exactly what's at stake." Renee's composure cracked slightly. "Mom, you don't understand. The attorney we found, the will we prepared, everything was designed to make sure you're secure. If you fight this, if you bring in outside people, you'll only create chaos and legal fees and heartbreak." "The medication in my nightstand was not Ambien," I said. The room went silent. I watched Renee's face. I watched Martin's hand tighten on the doorframe. "It contained lorazepam," I said. "I had it tested." Renee stood up. Her voice when she spoke was unsteady. "Mom, I was just trying to help you sleep." "I think we're done for tonight," I said. They left. I heard them in the hallway, low, urgent voices. I sat at my writing desk and did not move until their door closed. Then I allowed myself to feel it, all of it, for exactly 10 minutes. The grief of it, The profound, exhausting grief of what my daughter had become, or perhaps what she had always been. And I had loved her too much to see. After 10 minutes, I picked up the phone and called Frances. Then I called my cousin Margaret in Brevard and asked if I could stay with her for a week. I needed to breathe. I needed distance. I needed to come back strong. Margaret's house in Brevard was small and cheerful, full of plants and quilts and the smell of wood smoke. She was 71 and had outlasted 2 bad marriages and a bout of breast cancer with the kind of good-natured ferocity that I had always admired. I had told her the essential facts on the phone. She had not asked unnecessary questions. She had simply said, "Come." I stayed for 6 days. On the 3rd day, Renee called my cell phone 4 times. I let them go to voicemail. The messages began as concerned, "Mom, we're worried, please call," and shifted, by the 4th message, into something more deliberate. Renee's voice was measured, rehearsed. She said she had spoken to a doctor she knew who specialized in elder cognition. She said that my behavior, the sudden secrecy, the refusal to communicate, the suspicious thinking, might indicate that my heart condition was affecting my judgment. She said she was only mentioning this out of love and because she didn't want me to make decisions I would regret. She was preparing a narrative. A woman acting strangely, disconnected from her family, perhaps not entirely of sound mind. It was a preemptive move. If I accused them, she wanted a counterstory ready. I had expected it. Frances had warned me that this was a common tactic in elder financial abuse cases. I forwarded the voicemail recordings to Frances that evening. Martin sent a text message the following day. It was brief and in its way almost elegant in its manipulation. "Dorothy, I know things are tense. I want you to know that whatever happens, I've always respected you. You built something remarkable with Gerald. We don't want to be on opposite sides. Let's talk. Just the 2 of us without lawyers. I think we can find a way through this that doesn't hurt anyone." I read it once. I did not reply. Cold calm was not something I had possessed naturally in my youth. I had been, for most of my life, a warm and reactive woman. Quick to laugh, quick to cry, quick to engage. But grief does something to a person. Gerald's illness had done it to me. Watching him diminish day by day over 14 months, staying present, staying steady, continuing to make the right decisions even when everything in me wanted to collapse, had changed the architecture of my composure. I knew how to wait. I knew how to hold. I spent those 6 days in Brevard doing ordinary things. I walked the French Broad River Trail in the mornings. I helped Margaret put up her storm windows. I cooked a pot of chicken and dumplings that lasted 3 days. I read. I slept without medication and woke up feeling, for the first time in months, like myself. Frances called on Wednesday with an update. The pharmacist's written report had been received. The sheriff's department had assigned a detective named Howell to the case. Frances had made contact with a senior investigator at North Carolina's Adult Protective Services. "The structure is solid now," she said. "We're ready to move when you are." I also called Ruth Ann Hartley, my old colleague from the high school, who had become a fierce advocate for senior citizens after her own mother was victimized by a financial scammer 10 years earlier. Ruth Ann drove up from Hendersonville, and we sat at Margaret's kitchen table for 3 hours. She brought me into contact with a support network she had helped organize. A group of women in western North Carolina, many of them widows, who had experienced similar attempts by family members or caregivers. They met informally, twice a month. Several had taken legal action. Several had won. I joined the group. On my last evening in Brevard, Margaret and I sat on her porch with cups of tea as the mountains went dark and the first stars appeared. She said, You know, the hardest part isn't the legal fight. No, I said. The hardest part is not hating her. Margaret looked at the stars. You can love someone completely and still refuse to let them destroy you. I thought about that for a long time. The next morning, I drove back to Asheville. I parked in my own driveway, unlocked my own front door, walked into my own house. The papers Renee had left on the kitchen table were still there. I picked them up, carried them to my study, and placed them in the folder Frances had labeled Exhibit A. I made coffee. I watered my plants. I sat in Gerald's chair by the window and watched the street. They would come again, I was sure of that. I was ready. They came on a Saturday, 2 weeks after I returned from Brevard. Renee arrived first, alone, at 10 in the morning. She knocked instead of using her key. That was new. She was dressed quietly, no jewelry, no makeup to speak of. She was carrying a tin of the lemon shortbread she knew I loved, the kind she only baked when she wanted something. I let her in. I put the kettle on. We sat at the kitchen table. She began by apologizing. She was very good at it. The apology was layered. Sorrow for making me feel pressured. Acknowledgement that the documents had come too quickly. Regret that I had felt managed. She reached across the table and took my hand. Her eyes were wet. Mom, I'm scared. That's all this ever was. I'm scared of losing you like we lost Dad, and I overstepped, and I'm so sorry. I listened. I kept my face soft. I knew every word was a performance, but I also understood that beneath the performance there was perhaps a thread of something real. A daughter who did, in some partial and distorted way, love her mother. That was the most painful part. It was not purely monstrous. It was human. And it had still come within days of destroying me. I looked around my kitchen, the windowsill with Gerald's old coffee mug I still kept there, the calendar with my handwriting marking Tuesday lunches, the hook by the door where my garden gloves hung. Everything ordinary, everything mine. And across the table, my daughter, performing grief over a mother she had already begun to bury in her plans. I forgive you, I said, because I meant it, though not in the way she intended me to mean it. Relief moved across her face. She squeezed my hand. Then she said, I'd love it if we could just sit down with the new attorney, someone neutral, someone you've never met, and go over everything together. Not my draft, a fresh one. Clean slate. Just to make sure you're protected. That's all I'm asking. There it was. The neutral attorney. The clean slate. The process she could control by being in the room. I have my own attorney now, I said pleasantly. Frances Odom. She's handling everything. Renee withdrew her hand slowly. Mom, Frances is someone you found through a neighbor. You don't know her background, her experience with estates. She was a family law attorney in Charlotte for 30 years, I said. I'm very comfortable with her. A pause. Martin would like to see you. He's welcome to come inside. Martin came in from wherever he had been waiting. The car, I assumed. He was dressed in his good jacket. He sat down and, for a moment, looked almost genuinely uncomfortable. Then the performance settled over him again. Dorothy, he said, I want to say something man to man, woman to man. He paused at the phrase, acknowledged the awkwardness with a small smile. You've hired an attorney. You've been talking to people about things that are private family matters. I understand you're upset, but what you may not fully understand is the legal exposure you're creating for yourself. I beg your pardon, I said, making accusations of elder abuse. He said it calmly as though explaining a technical term, against family members, without evidence that can actually hold up. Those kinds of claims can be very damaging to everyone, including the person making them. Courts don't look kindly on elderly individuals who make claims they can't substantiate. It puts your own judgment into question. He held my gaze. It was meant to frighten me. It was, I had to admit, somewhat effective. A cold, prickling fear moved through me. Not of him exactly, but of the machinery he was invoking. Legal systems. Courts. The humiliation of being portrayed as a confused old woman who had accused her family out of paranoia. I thought of my students, the ones who had faced a difficult passage in a novel and wanted to skip ahead to find the easier version of the story. I had always told them, stay in the hard part. The hard part is where you learn what the author actually meant. I appreciate your concern, I said. We're not your enemies, Dorothy. We're trying to protect you. From what? I asked. He blinked. You keep saying you're protecting me, I said. Protecting me from what, exactly? From my own attorney? From my own doctor? From deciding for myself what happens to my house? He recalibrated. From making decisions under stress that you might regret. Martin, I said, I'm a 74-year-old retired teacher who has been running my own life for over half a century. I believe I'm capable of deciding what I might regret. He looked at Renee. Something passed between them. A quick, involuntary exchange, the kind that happens between people who have rehearsed a scene and suddenly found themselves off script. Renee looked down at her hands. Martin's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. We'll give you more time, Renee said at last. Her voice had gone flat, the performance stripped away entirely now. But Mom, I want you to know that if this becomes adversarial, if lawyers start sending letters and investigators start asking questions, it will tear this family apart. And that's on you, not us. You. She stood. Martin stood. Neither of them touched me on the way out. The tin of lemon shortbread sat unopened on the table. I noticed as Martin passed the kitchen doorway that his eyes moved once, quickly, automatically, across the room, the way they always did. Cataloging. Estimating. Even now, even in retreat. They left. I heard the car pull out of the driveway. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The fear was still there, cold and real. The fear of consequences, of damage, of a public fight with my own daughter. I felt its full weight, and I did not try to push it away. I had learned that fear ignored has a way of returning larger. And then I thought of Martin's hand on the doorframe, the night I told them about the lorazepam. I thought of the voicemail, the neutral attorney, the implication that I was too old to be trusted with my own affairs. I thought of the tin of shortbread and what it had been meant to accomplish. The fear didn't disappear, but it hardened into something useful. I called Frances on Monday morning and told her we were ready to move. Frances had spent 3 weeks quietly and methodically building what she called a complete structural case. By the time we were ready to act, there was a pharmacist's written analysis, a medical record from Dr. Reeves documenting the unauthorized benzodiazepine, a sworn statement from my cardiologist describing Renee's unauthorized inquiries, a police report filed with the Buncombe County Sheriff's Office, a completed referral to Adult Protective Services, and a recorded voicemail in which Renee had obliquely referenced my cognition as a preemptive narrative device. Frances had also obtained phone records showing that Martin had made multiple calls to a second attorney, not the estate attorney, in the weeks leading up to the night I overheard him. The decisive meeting was held in Frances's office on a Tuesday morning in December, 12 days before Christmas. Frances had requested that Renee and Martin attend, and she had phrased it neutrally enough, a mediated discussion to avoid prolonged legal proceedings, that they had agreed. They arrived together, Martin in his good jacket again, Renee with her hair done carefully. They sat across the conference table from Frances and me. Their attorney, whose name was Terrence Bale, sat beside Martin. I had not known they would bring Bale, but Francis had prepared for it. I had been in that office twice before, for document signings, but that morning it felt different. The long oak table, the winter light coming flat and white through the blinds, the particular silence of a room in which something consequential is about to happen. I had felt that silence before, in hospital waiting rooms, in Gerald's last weeks. I knew how to sit inside it. Francis began by placing a single sheet of paper on the table. It was the pharmacist's analysis. She did not explain it. She let Bale and Martin read it in silence. Bale said, "This analysis is based on a pill taken from Mrs. Callahan's home. There's no established chain of custody. The pill bottle bears the label Dorothy Callahan, dated October 14th, dispensed by a pharmacy in Biltmore Village," Francis said. "The pharmacy has no record of that prescription. The prescribing physician listed on the label does not have Dorothy as a patient." She placed a second document on the table, the pharmacy's written statement confirming no record of the prescription. Renee's face had gone very still. "We also have the records from 2 phone calls placed to Dr. Kathleen Murray's office," Francis continued, "in which the caller, who identified herself as Dorothy's primary caregiver and daughter, inquired specifically about the timeline of cognitive decline associated with Dorothy's cardiac diagnosis. Dr. Murray has documented both calls and confirmed she did not have Dorothy's authorization to discuss her case with any third party." Francis placed those records on the table. Martin said, "This is a mischaracterization of entirely normal family concern. The police report filed November 8th documents suspected elder financial abuse," Francis said, without raising her voice. She placed the report on the table. "The Adult Protective Services referral was opened November 9th. A PS conducted its own preliminary investigation and found sufficient grounds to proceed. Their investigator is available to speak with your client's attorney today, Mr. Bale, if he wishes." Bale leaned over and said something quietly to Martin. Martin's jaw was tight. Renee looked at me across the table. For a moment, she looked simply like my daughter. Frightened and young in a way she hadn't been for 30 years. The careful hair, the composed expression, all of it had slipped. Beneath it was something rawer, something I recognized from a very long time ago. The face she used to make as a child when she had been caught in a lie and knew that I knew. I had always found it easier then to forgive her. That was the trap I had spent 50 years inside. "Mom," she said, and her voice broke slightly. "Mom, I know what you did," I said. I kept my voice even. "I know what the medication was. I know what Martin said on the phone the night of October 7th. I know what the documents were designed to accomplish. I am not confused, Renee. I was never confused." Martin said, "We can resolve this privately. There is no need for APS, no need for any of this to go further. If Dorothy is feeling pressured, we can simply withdraw the documents, and the documents were withdrawn 3 weeks ago," Francis said. "Dorothy signed a new independent will and living trust on November 22nd, witnessed by 2 independent parties and filed with the county. Additionally, a report of the medication incident has been forwarded to the North Carolina Medical Board, as the prescription label names a physician who may have been complicit. And as of this morning, we have filed a formal complaint with the state bar regarding the estate attorney who drafted the original documents. Given the clear evidence that the documents were designed to benefit the drafting party's clients at the expense of an elderly client they did not represent." Bale said nothing. He was, I noticed, writing quickly. His pen had not stopped moving since Francis placed the third document on the table. Whatever he had been told to expect when he walked into this room, it had not been this. Martin turned to me. The warmth was entirely gone. His face, without the performance, was something I had never quite seen before. Not angry, exactly, but stripped, exposed. The face of a man who had believed he was smarter than the situation and had just discovered he was not. His voice was quiet and flat. "You have no idea what you've started, Dorothy." "I have a complete idea," I said. "That's the difference between us." Renee put her face in her hands. The meeting ended shortly afterward. Bale requested a recess to consult with his client. Frances granted it. In the hallway, while we waited, she put her hand briefly on my shoulder and said, "You did very well." I nodded. I was thinking about Gerald and about how he would have smiled. Not a triumphant smile. Gerald had never been a man who enjoyed winning over people. But the particular smile he reserved for moments when something difficult had been done with integrity, the smile that said, "This is how it was supposed to go." The months that followed were not without their difficulties. Legal processes are slow and imperfect, and justice, when it comes, rarely arrives the way it does in the stories we were told as children. Suddenly, dramatically, with clear sides and unambiguous outcomes. But it came. The Adult Protective Services investigation concluded in January with a formal finding of financial exploitation and medication misuse. The finding was entered into the state registry. It would follow Renee and Martin in any future proceedings involving vulnerable adults. The criminal matter moved more slowly. The Buncombe County Sheriff assigned Detective Howell to the case in November, and by February he had assembled enough evidence, including the pharmacy records, the medical documentation, and phone records obtained through a warrant, to refer the case to the district attorney's office for consideration of charges. In March, the DA filed charges against Martin Greer for elder financial exploitation under North Carolina General Statute 14-112.2. The charge was a Class F felony. Renee was not charged criminally. There was insufficient direct evidence that she had knowingly provided a controlled substance with intent to harm. The medication case was circumstantial enough that the DA declined to prosecute it as a criminal matter. But she was named as a respondent in the APS civil finding, and Frances filed a civil suit on my behalf seeking damages for financial manipulation, emotional distress, and costs associated with the legal proceedings. In April, Martin's attorney reached out to Frances to discuss a settlement. Martin did not want a trial. A trial meant testimony, and testimony meant the recorded phone conversations, the pharmacy records, the cardiologist's documentation, all of it read aloud in a courtroom where journalists and neighbors and anyone else who cared to attend could hear it. I thought of all the Saturday afternoons Martin had stood in my driveway, talking to neighbors about their property values, the easy authority in his voice, the way people deferred to him. A courtroom would cost him that. The settlement offer was, in its way, an admission of how much that cost him. Frances presented me with the settlement offer and explained my options. I took 24 hours to think about it. "I want accountability," I told Frances, "not money." "Then we don't settle," she said. We didn't settle. The trial was held in June. It was 4 days. I testified for 2 hours on the second day. I wore Gerald's pearls and the gray wool suit I had worn to the most important meetings of my life, and I answered every question in a clear voice. The prosecutor was a young woman named Diaz, who had a precise, unhurried manner I found reassuring. She asked me to describe, in my own words, the night of October 7th. I described it. I described the hallway, the cold floor under my bare feet, the glass of water in my hand, Martin's voice through the door. I described what I felt. I described what I decided. I did not cry. I had decided some weeks earlier that I would not give them my tears. Not in a courtroom, not in a newspaper, not in any record that would outlast the moment. I had spent enough of my emotional life in service of other people's comfort. These 2 hours belonged to the truth. Martin's attorney attempted, on cross-examination, to suggest that my hearing was unreliable, that the hallway conversation could have been misinterpreted, that a woman with a cardiac condition taking nighttime medication might confuse the details of a half-heard exchange. I listened to each question carefully and answered it exactly. I did not elaborate beyond what was asked. I did not become defensive. I remained, as Francis had coached me, and as I had practiced in the mirror for 3 mornings running, simply clear. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They returned a guilty verdict on the primary charge and on a second charge of financial fraud related to the preparation of unauthorized documents. Martin was sentenced to 14 months in a minimum security facility and 3 years of probation. He was ordered to pay restitution. He would carry a criminal record for the rest of his life. I watched him receive the sentence from across the courtroom. He did not look at me. He looked at the floor, then at his attorney, then at some middle distance that contained, I supposed, the future he had planned, and the future he now had instead. The restitution figure was smaller than what Francis had sought. I had expected that. Courts measure financial harm in ways that don't fully account for the cost of fear, of lost sleep, of sitting at a kitchen table at 5 in the morning, trying to understand why your daughter had chosen this. But it was something. It was his name in a public record, permanent and unambiguous. Renee and I faced each other briefly in the courthouse hallway after the verdict. She looked diminished, thinner, older, her face held together by something that was not quite composure. She said, "I hope you're satisfied." I thought about what I wanted to say. There were many things. I thought about the lemon shortbread on the kitchen table. I thought about the goodnight kiss and the pill pressed into my palm. I thought about the voice through the door and the cold floor and the glass that shook. "I hope," I said, "that someday you'll understand what you almost took from me." She turned and walked away. I watched her go until she pushed through the courthouse doors and the December light swallowed her. Francis took me to lunch afterward at a restaurant on Lexington Avenue with big windows and late afternoon light. We had a glass of wine. She told me it was one of the most thoroughly documented elder abuse cases she had seen in her career. I thanked her. She thanked me for my patience, for my precision, for the legal pad covered in lists. Driving home, I passed the street where I had taught for so many years. The school was still there, brick and familiar. I thought of all the students I had watched read their first difficult texts, the ones who wanted the story to be simpler than it was, and the ones who stayed with the complexity until it opened. I had stayed with the complexity. I turned onto my street. The White House was there, in the December light, exactly as it had always been. The rose bushes needed cutting back. The porch needed a new coat of paint. It was mine. The year that followed the trial was the best year I had lived since Gerald was healthy. I know that sounds like a strange thing to say, that the aftermath of betrayal in legal proceedings could somehow open into something good. But I had learned something during those months that I hadn't known I needed to learn, what I was capable of, and what my life actually contained. In the fall, I enrolled in a watercolor class at the Arts Center on Merriman Avenue. Gerald had always encouraged me to try painting, and I had always found an excuse not to. I was not particularly talented, but I enjoyed it with a wholeness that surprised me. I painted the mountains in October, the rose garden in May, and Gerald's reading chair in the afternoon light 3 times until I got the shadow right. Patsy and I established a proper Tuesday lunch that we rarely missed. We added Ruth Ann Hartley on the 3rd Tuesday of every month. The 3 of us ate well and talked about books and local politics, and the small indignities and unexpected pleasures of being women of a certain age in a world that persistently underestimated us. The support group Ruth Ann had introduced me to became something I gave back to as much as I took from it. By spring, I was helping newer members navigate the early stages of what they were facing. The fear, the grief of discovering that someone you loved had been calculating behind your kind eyes. I kept the house. I planted climbing roses along the back fence, deep pink, a variety Gerald had mentioned once and never gotten around to. I had the porch repainted white and bought a new armchair in forest green for the study. Lily and Connor's college funds received their bequests on schedule. I wrote them each a letter explaining in age-appropriate terms that I loved them. Lily, 16 and already paying close attention to the world, wrote me back a letter that made me press my hand over my heart for a long moment. Renee and Martin's life came apart in the year following the verdict with the quiet thoroughness of a structure whose foundations had always been weaker than they appeared. Martin served 9 months before early release. The criminal record cost him his commercial real estate license. He appealed. The appeal failed. He found work eventually in property management. I didn't see him again. Renee moved to Charlotte. I heard through Patsy that she had struggled with Martin's legal situation, the financial stress, with whatever version of herself she had to live with now that everything had failed so completely. I had decided not to wonder about her remorse. It was not cruelty. It was self-preservation. I had given 50 years of love to my daughter, and she had nearly used it to destroy me. There was a boundary I needed to maintain, not out of hatred, but out of respect for my own survival. I used part of the civil settlement to establish a scholarship at my former high school, the Gerald and Dorothy Callahan Award for Critical Thinking. The first recipient was a girl named Maya, who was exceptionally good at reading difficult texts and finding the truth in them. I attended the ceremony in the spring, watching Maya accept her certificate with a composure that seemed slightly too old for her 17 years. She reminded me of myself. On the drive home, I stopped at the overlook above the city, window down in the warm May air, looking at the mountains, green now, fully in leaf, enormous and unhurried. 74 years old, I thought. Still here, still mine. The night I stood in that dark hallway and heard my husband's voice say, "The problem will resolve itself." I could have gone back to bed and pretended I hadn't heard. Many people do. Fear is powerful, and love makes us want to believe the best. But I had been taught, by books, by decades, by loss, that truth, once known, cannot safely be ignored. If someone you trust is quietly preparing to take everything from you, do not wait for them to finish. What would you have done in my place? If this story reached you somewhere real, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. And if you believe someone else needs to hear it, please share it. Thank you for listening.